It had been over a month since the convoy came through. At least we knew they weren't going to immediately send their aircraft over, but still, I was surprised to see them again. And what was more surprising is they were in one hell of a hurry. Hell, they didn't even slow down. They just told their gunner to launch a red flare up. This was enough to get us all running or flying in their directions, trying to find out what in the hell was going on. They had a new officer, and their commander was running up to the first human they saw and just straight up screaming for help. The NCO he was with, which was the same one as the previous convoy, came up yelling at the turret gunners to stand down. These are not enemies. He kept having to say that, and eventually he got up actually into the turret and slapped one of his own people across the face. Crude, but effective. I landed as the officer, a captain this time, was explaining. He was explaining about a massive swarm moving, along with its queen, and it was going to be close. Real close to us. They were unable to get enough firepower in range in time, and a major population center was currently in danger of being overrun. If the bugs made a mad dash, there's nothing they could do. There was no way to evacuate everybody in time, especially since fuel was very much rationed. If there was any chance we had to slow them down, they were asking us to help them out and do it. With that, he pulls out a map as we all begin to look across. The swarm was going to pass one valley away from the spider nest. We all kind of grinned at this. If we hurry, we can get the entire swarm to fall right into the trap. We had already talked this over with the previous officer and kind of wishing he was here because he already knew what was going on. I immediately go to take off and get the plan set and in motion, and then I hear the radio chatter. I pause right before leaving, and as I jump up, I fold my wings back and slam right next to the officer. I got right up next to him and said, "Those in that webbing, they're part of our family. You better tell those planes or helicopters or whatever's coming, if they fire on those webs, you will never enter this area again. Understood?" The captain was nervous but a little defiant as he said how I had no reason to give him orders. Eventually, his NCOC just simply walked in front of him, turned to me and said, "Roger." He immediately turned to his RTO, which had a fister next to him, and a TAC P, and they immediately started calling, letting everybody know who was friendly and who wasn't. With that, I immediately took off because we did not have a lot of time. I reached the nest and surprised them as I landed with a very loud thud and started yelling. The queen exactly was not happy at all. I just interrupted her meal, and usually with them, the meals are very, well, it's a big part of their social structures, so she was not exactly happy about the sudden burst that came in. But I told her about the incurring swarm. The queen called for all of her minions. The younger ones and the pregnant would go to the rear, and they would hide inside the nest, the most protected place they knew of. All able to fight needed to prepare immediately. I told her I would be back with everyone, and I immediately took off as fast as I could. Reaching back to the convoy, everybody was busy arming themselves. I reached in, grabbed a bandolier of grenades, a vest full of ammo, which I immediately tried to put on, but that was difficult at best. And once that was on, I grabbed a rifle, cleared it, checked it, dropped a magazine in it, and had some strange looks as everyone realized what I was doing. I said, "What? Where are the Molotov cocktails?" The officer immediately turned to me and told me how cocktails wouldn't kill the queen. I simply talked without looking at him. "No shit. I'm not trying to kill it. I'm just trying to piss it off." "What type of bugs are they anyway?" The officer, still put back by my comments, simply responded, "We think they might be a mutated termite." Without skipping a beat, one of my buddies, still fully human, simply stated, "Oh, the queens are gonna love this." I grinned a little bit at this and then simply tried to take to the skies, and I wouldn't be alone. Though only experienced flyers, and I do stress only experienced flyers would be in on this mission. The young ones had to stay behind or stay at a very, very safe distance if they wanted to even know what was going on. However, the youngest ones were not going to be able to go, and eventually we had to threaten them with a belt to make sure they stayed put. One of them, I still remember, reached over and grabbed the back of her legs, realizing that she did not want to get a taste of that ever again. Thankfully, this time I had a radio, and it was already keyed in to where I needed to. I could see the air support coming, so I immediately called them. I used my old call sign, Sierra 7, and made sure they understood the plan. They needed to know this, as they didn't have a lot of ordnance with them. They were scrambled way too quickly. And I could see the storm was approaching. And it was reaching the target area fast. I mean, really fast. Even if we had seen them, there's no way we'd be able to even think about dealing with them, not without some heavy shit. We look, and the area looks good. The termite queen is with several hundred of her brood. This was surprising, as they usually don't go with a brood this big. Something must have happened. Either she's going for food or she's running from something. But I don't have time to worry about that now. Along with her brood, about 70 of them are flying. But it's kind of weird. They're flying really, really slow. They should be moving a whole lot faster than that. And I look close, and I could see that they're carrying things. I can also see that they're moving their heads. They know I'm around, but it seems like they really don't care. As they get to the target area, we call in, and of course the fast movers come in and drop an incendiary device of some sort. This blocked their advance, as they would have to actually go through, I'm guessing, either napalm or Willie P. They did not want to do that. Bugs hate the fire, of course. The next round was coming in was HE, and it was landing on the opposite side of the spider's nest. So either face the explosions or face the fire. Well, they're not going back the opposite way, so that only left one option. Once they stopped and seemingly thought about it for a minute, they finally began to turn. As they did, our runners on the ground, our fastest ground-based personnel, were able to actually make a whole lot of noise. They were able to get the swarm's attention, and eventually the queen saw this and thought, hey, easy meal. They then began to chase them, and this is exactly what we wanted. The runners booked it through the forest and up the side of the hill as fast as possible. The flyers with me dropped our Molotov cocktails on the back of the swarm as they were moving forward. This way we would pick off a few of theirs while we went on. Along with that, we may or may have not caught the queen's ass as her bulbous butt was moving. The flying bugs began to chase us after that and ended up right towards the nest. We ended up having to go across the mountain, of course, and I could see the runners making it up the hill. They even got a head start, but holy crap, are they quick. There's no way even flying I could keep up with them. I looked back to see that the flying bugs were still chasing us, and good. I slowed down just a little bit to make them think they were catching up, because I knew what was waiting for them. The only helicopters they could scrape up was a single squadron waiting, only 4 of them, and they would take out the flying bugs. On the way up the hill, I was worried that they were going to blast us too. I was just hoping that they remembered who the friends and foes were. Mostly, they were going to have to take precision shots with their cannons, and thankfully, that's exactly what they did. The flyers that were chasing us, some sort of, I don't know, looked like a giant mosquito almost, were simply torn to pieces by the cannons being fired. It was an amalgamation of helicopters. I saw one Apache and something that looked like a little bird, but it had a lot of guns on it. Then again, you can always strap guns on those things. But honestly, I didn't care about finding out. As soon as we crested the hill, I dove. I did not want to be around when those things start spitting fire. The queen wasn't far behind. She began to get up and over the ridge, and just as she did, the helicopters bugged out as fast as they could. They did not have the firepower to bust through her carapace. The swarm, as soon as the queen saw what was on the other side, charged down as the queen was struck just barely. The flyers, such as myself, the villagers, and soldiers had already lined up at the base of the hill and were firing up at her. The charge was going to meet a wall of lead, as all the different species came down. They seemed to look almost like termites, sure, but they were somewhat different. I don't know what the hell happened, what she had bred with, or what she had eaten. I really don't care what the hell their physiology does. But all the small ones ended up being torn to pieces as they charged at us, though that didn't seem to stop them. Eventually, they got close enough for grenades, and I surprised the crap out of those who were with me as I pulled the safety off, popped the secondary, and screamed frag out as I lobbed that sucker as far as I could. Being as tall as I was, it was pretty easy to get some good distance, and just as it landed, kablooey. As I got back up, I noticed that the soldiers were looking at me as though, how did he know that? Until I told them, why'd you stop shooting? Shoot, you stupid son of a... With that, the wall of lead erupted again. The issue was, the queen was getting close. Real close. As soon as she got within grenade range, we started screaming, break contact! Break contact! And immediately turned and ran straight through the nest. Our wonderful arachnid friends had set up a tunnel from one side to the other. With this, the bugs wouldn't see us running away. However, we had to make sure we didn't touch the walls. Of course, they were all made of spider silk and very, very sticky. It made it difficult to run, but definitely not impossible. They cleaned up as best they could. I asked them before to leave a little area that we could walk through, but it never seems to last very long. It seems as though many of them still have their, say, animalistic nature. However, it wouldn't matter too much. We did lob the grenades and end up damaging the queen a little bit. Although at that point I was really wishing I had a 50 caliber. At that point, I don't think it would have mattered. You don't stop a 50 from piercing through. But as soon as the queen hit the nest, none of it mattered. She began to get hung up on the webbing as all the little ones that were left, which was barely a dozen, began to as well. As she began to thrash a little bit as the very front of her reached the edge of the web, or maybe I should say the walls of the nest. The nest itself seemed to take on a life of its own. The spiders in charge, all of them, charged out with unbelievable fury. They began to wrap up the remaining few brood that were still outside. The small ones were wrapped up in a matter of moments. A full-size brood seemed to be wrapped up in approximately 4 seconds to the point where it couldn't move and then just left there. It would be wrapped the rest of the way later. The queen tried to get away as best she could, but now too many of her legs were simply stuck. She tried to pull away, but it seemed the more she fought, the more she got entangled. And with this, the spiders were able to run around and wrap the queen up, beginning to hold down all of her legs, locking her in position. The more she tried to move her legs, the more she would pull in and get wrapped up even tighter. She was still alive as she was wrapped up and dragged into the nest, giving off a slight screech with every single pull. Every single time she was drawn in, it seemed she knew that she was well and royally fucked. The soldiers, watching on the other side of the nest, once they had run through, of course, watched this whole thing go down and were all pale. It was like a child who was watching a deer get butchered. They just couldn't believe what they were watching. The spider's movements were so fast, so efficient. It was just instinctively horrifying to see. They worried that if these spiders went there, what would happen? I laughed and said, oh, what would happen is not the same thing that's going to happen to that queen. One of the younger ones said, what are you talking about? I'll tell you later. And with that, we started to head back to the town. Why? There was a celebration waiting. Some of the flyers had already taken to the skies and decided to get ahead of us. I decided to walk with everybody back. Most of them didn't feel like eating for a while after seeing what the arachnids had actually done. They were kind of, shall I say, digesting the battle. Later on, I was actually discussing the battle with the commander and his NCO, and they were actually surprised. The amount of ordnance they needed to do this was far less than they believed they had to. They had taken down queens before and emptied entire ahas, ammo holding areas, trying to take one or two of these down, and lost so many. But now they didn't lose any, and they had taken down an entire queen and brood. Many of the soldiers were still shaking due to the adrenaline that was just starting to run down their system. I told them to relax because the party actually hasn't started yet, as I put a drink in their hand. A few hours later, the Arachne decided to actually show up to the party, and I'm glad they did, although they had absolutely no appetite. Why didn't they eat? Well, it seems as though they already had dinner. Enjoying a fresh pot of coffee, they started to get a little tipsy as spiders get completely drunk off caffeine. Thankfully, we were brought fresh beans from the convoy and were able to make an entire fresh pot, and boy, that was good. I can't drink alcohol because of, well, my biology, but the coffee was still nice. I was actually surprised to see the Arachne didn't bring any of their males with them, but a good thing too, as they began to party with any male that was willing, and by the time they got there, most of the guys were pretty well hammered. Near midnight, the kids were already asleep. They had pretty much burned out all their energy. The queen of the Arachne came over to talk with me, the commander, and his first sergeant, actually. And the queen asked, "Why do you never partake?" I figured she already knew the answer, but she was all sorts of wobbly. So wobbly, in fact, that she didn't even realize she was close to the fire we were sitting next to. Normally, they don't want to be anywhere near it. She was still satisfied from her meal. I could see it in her eyes. She was also still hammered from the dark roast coffee that she had drank. And she was still, I'm guessing, satisfied and still a little amorous from eating all those fresh eggs. I had to inform the soldiers about how they get this way after eating bug eggs, especially from a queen that's either alive or freshly deceased. This kind of disgusted them, but they were also intrigued by it, especially with a Arachne standing there without any clothing on, which made things more interesting, especially since the first generation Arachne were at least 50% human, especially all the interesting parts. Along with that, many of the younger ones were at least 75% human-like. In fact, one or two just barely had a few pieces of chitin on their skin that made them even close to look like an Arachne. Well, that and the fact that one of them could still produce silk out of, I don't know if it was the right or the left butt cheek. It was kind of weird. You would think it'd come out of the spine area, but nope. All in all, though, it was a hell of a view. In regards to her question of it, I pulled in one of my dolls with my tail as she was right next to me, and of course reached out with my arm and my wing on the other to my female femme fatale next to me, and told her, "I assure you, I partake plenty." With my other arm, I was stroking the slight baby bump on my doll, who was sitting there almost completely asleep, but seemed to almost coo at the idea of having another child. The soldiers were actually surprised at this, and I simply looked and said, "If you want to partake, I'm not going to stop you." I could see they had the thought in their eyes, but neither of them wanted to stop being professional. I simply picked up my girls, both of which were asleep, one on each side, and walked away. When I came back, it was only me next to the fire for a long time, kind of wishing I didn't have this really, really jacked up sleep schedule. Before leaving 2 days later, as they ended up having to sleep off the party, all brass, bullets, weapons, and gear were returned from the nest. Everything that they had expended had already been picked up by their Arachne and brought in, and they were unbelievably thrilled about this, as many of the ones who had made the run through the tunnel had accidentally hit the muzzle against the side of the webbing itself and had the weapon just yanked right out of their hand. Once it gets a hold of, it's like super glue around a high tension cable. You're not getting it out. However, the Arachne are able to take it out easily. The captain was extremely happy because he's signed for all this stuff, and now, it's going to save him a lot of problems. They told us that the first convoy of goods were coming in about 4 days, roughly. 4, maybe 5. Well, that's a good thing to know. We will have to have our food ready, I told them. While saying goodbye, the captain asked, "By the way, what's your full name and rank?" I simply looked at him. Who I was is of little to no importance. All you need to worry about is who I am now. A young NCO from inside the Humvee actually leaned out and said, "I told you, sir. A lot of people died back then. If I was in his shoes, looking down at my taloned feet, I would be the same way. Gotta remember, it's not just who dies, but what dies back then." The captain pondered for a second, then turned back. "I just wanted to confirm who I was talking to." I steeled myself for the response. "Captain, you already know who you are talking to." Then I stick out my clawed hand, and he shakes my hand, and the convoy leaves without any other incidents. As they disappear out of sight, I think, well, I guess I'd better get back. It's been a couple of days. Maybe I'll snag a goose or two on the way back home. Oh, if I can, the kids are going to love that.